Hello everyone, welcome back to What is this weapon? And I know what you're thinking, this is one of the most obvious weapons in history. It's an AR-15. Another AR-15. We've done others before, and in fact, a while back now, we covered one of the UK variants, UK service variants of the M16A2. So we're kind of working backwards, although I'd have to do the demarco at some point. I'm not that organised. So we are nonetheless going backwards, and this is an M16A1. I'll very briefly run through what that means for those of you who aren't aware. So this is essentially the, dare I say, fixed version of the M16 from the Vietnam era. There's an XM16E1 in Vietnam, and it morphs into or is just renamed as actually the M16A1. So A1 in the US system, M16 is the baseline model, and then A1 is the improvement, although complicating factor, the US Air Force used just the M16, and the US Army used the M16A1, the only difference being this device here, the forward assist, which you can slap to force the bolt home if there's a problem. Something that the Army wanted and the US Air Force did not, and the Air Force adopted it first. So M16, M16A1. Recognition-wise, elephant in the room for those of you who know the weapon, this is an A2 pistol grip. I'll explain why that's on there a bit later on, but otherwise it has the fully open, or slotted all the way round, I should say, bird cage type flash hider. Looks a bit vaguely like a bird cage, sort of. Still has the triangular handguards of the original AR-15 M16. The A1 has a butt trap there for storing cleaning kit, which is quite central to the Vietnam story of how the M16 got fixed and why it had a problem in the first place. Maybe that's for another time. And the what's called the full fence lower receiver. So it essentially shrouds the magazine catch from getting bumped and your magazine dropping out. So it's many people's favourite M16 or AR-15 because it marks the period in history where all the teething problems are over. That's the US story. Now, I've chosen this. I was going to come around to it anyway, for reasons that will become apparent. This is an actual UK service example with a little bit of history to it. But the reason I chose it for this week is I was involved recently in my very first and very last Twitter argument, or X if you prefer. And I unwittingly stumbled into this. I think someone tagged me into a discussion. And there were a couple of people, essentially, from my perspective at least, swearing black is white, you know, that level of kind of, what? That there is no such thing as a fully automatic AR-15. That the AR-15 is just the civilian, semi-automatic version of the M16, if you like, or you could look at it the other way around. The M16 is always automatic or burst. AR-15 is always semi-automatic. And there's sort of political underpinnings to that I won't get into, but on a technical level and a historical level, it's just not true. So I thought, before I get into the object history, if you like, we'll briefly explain why that's not the case, or one bit of evidence at least. Now, not helping my argument is the fact that this example just says, so it has the rampant Colt, the rampant horse logo, Colt M16A1, cal 5.56mm, and then the serial number, which is in the 9 million range. It's a lot of millions. So these are commercial markings. These are not US GI government markings, because this is a commercial rifle sold to the British. It just says M16A1. It doesn't say AR-15. So that doesn't really support my my contention here. And by the way, bloke on the range was already on the case in this Twitter thread, so I left him to it. And again, if we grab an SP1, so AR-15, SP1, very, very similar. This happens to have a short magazine on it and a few tags hanging off it, which I hope you'll forgive. Semi-automatic, so later SP1, so it has the later flash hider, but it has an early type lower receiver, no forward assist, a few specific features like that. Needn't trouble us too much. But again, if you look at this, it says Colt AR-15 with the logo. So on the face of it, these guys are right. The thing on the table is an M16, albeit commercial iteration of it. And this is an AR-15. Uh-oh. Well, it's not as simple as that. So let me grab yet another AR-15 and show you the roll marks on this one. So this is also an M16A1, but it is a US government M16A1. And if we zoom in on those markings, we will see the standard markings from 1958, 9, when the first serial examples are being made, prototypes in 57, all the way through to the 7 million range. So early 80s, around about that time. This is absolutely a Colt AR-15 M16A1. And think of it like beer. Beer is the substance. Lager is one variant of it, or one type of it. Ale is another. This is maybe maybe the SP1 is the lager, and this is the ale. My analogy has gone off the rails, but it's that level of relationship. The thing was invented as the Armalite AR-15. They were all automatic, all capable of automatic fire. It wasn't until 1964 that you get the SP1 back there, created as a civilian variant of the intended military rifle. It was invented first and foremost as a military rifle. Yes, Colt realized, or Colt in particular, realized early on that this thing had a market potentially in the civilian world. And so very quickly, they run side by side. There has long been a civilian AR-15. That's all true. But that does not prevent these guys from being AR-15. And that extends beyond Colt or FN production, military M16s being AR-15s, to Mark 18, even to something like the Knight's Armament KS-1 that we looked at the other week. They're not made by Colt, so you can say, well, they're not branded AR-15, but they're still generically AR-15s. An AKM doesn't have AKM written on the side. It's still an AKM. So enough nerdy ranting about that. Actually, not quite enough. Let's just give you a bit of a peek at this very rare early example. This one was made in 1959, and it is a model 01 or 601 with the green furniture, the very early features, and the roll mark on that one, unsurprisingly, slightly different version of it, but it is Colt, Armalite, AR-15. So the first thing to go is Armalite, and then early 80s, they stop putting AR-15 on the weapons. And because the SP1 still has AR-15 on it, this is where we get this false impression that AR-15 is civilian, M16 is only ever military. What it boils down to is there are fully automatic AR-15s. Some of them are M16s, some of them are M4s, that kind of thing. So that's what prompted me to get into this today. But the real inspiration is some work I've been doing for a while now with Matthew Moss from the Armourers Bench. We're working together on an article on the British AR-15. So there might be another one popping up at some point. He's looking at the service history. I'm looking at the sort of procurement and why they adopted it and how good was it and that kind of thing. And so I'm trying to identify, well, the first thing I did was try to identify British AR-15s. Now, we covered some of this before with the A2, in that there might be a different finish, a black paint finish. This doesn't have it, interestingly. Serial numbering the upper receiver, though, is pretty definitive. Any AR-15 or M16, whichever you'd like to call it. The early rifles were AR-15s only, because the Brits adopted them before they were, around about the same time, actually, as they were type classified M16, but they didn't get guns marked M16. But regardless, early Model 02 or Model 04 AR-15s bought in 1965, they have this serial, usually there on the earlier guns. By the A1 era, because there's another purchase of A1s, which is what I'm holding, it moves to this void in the carry handle here. So that's a dead giveaway if you ever see a picture of one of these. This one has some red markings on it as well. So there's a red line underlining the serial number, some sort of armoury significant mark there. And more tantalisingly for a firearms historian is a number on the other side of the magazine well, partly faded out, but you can still make it out. And that's typically what's typically known as a rack number. It's the individual number of the gun so that the armourer and soldiers can track the weapon in and out of the armoury, that kind of thing. It's on brown-bess muskets, usually on the tang of the butt plate, and it's sometimes on modern firearms as well. So that had me think, okay, so we know this is British service, British purchase. Can we work out the significance of this? Now, as I've mentioned in the previous video, these were used, they were either theatre specific, so anyone in the army that went to the Far East, Borneo, Malaya, would receive one instead of their SLR, and then they'd hand it back when they left. But they were also specific to Special Operations Forces, SAS, SBS, and I must admit, I was kind of hoping that that would be the case with this, and it turned out to be. So we don't have too much detail, but we can say that this was absolutely in the armouries of the UK Special Forces, and that it was deployed to Northern Ireland, Operation Banner, as it was known, and also to South Belize. Now, I'm sure some of you have seen or have heard of armour lights, as the British called them, and the Irish as well, referring to two different types of armour light. We've been there before, AR-18 and AR-15. This is the 15. But you might not be aware of Belize. Well, that was from at least 1978. There was a British garrison in Belize, and people like SAS would go on patrol there and they take their own weapons with them. It wasn't the same situation as Far East Land Forces, where you would pick up a rifle when you arrived. They had a personal weapon, which I guess the rack number kind of speaks to. Belize has a long history with the British Empire, British Commonwealth, gained its independence, but through an agreement with the British government, retained a sort of detachment, if you like, or garrison. And there's still British Army training goes on there today. You'll see photos, guys with SA-80s, typically, still on exercise in Belize. So there's still a relationship there. It's quite interesting. But things were a little bit more interesting, shall we say, on the tactical side in the late 70s, early 80s. The only slightly frustrating thing is this weird 9 million serial number range. It's a little bit unclear what exactly that means, but it seems that Colt operated parallel serial number ranges. So this is not as late as it seems. This is almost certainly made, this is probably about as old as I am, made late 79 or early 1980. Not quite a millennial, it's a Gen X rifle, as it likes to protest. Whereas 9 million would imply like significantly later than that, like M16 A2 era. But I am, based on the information we received on its service history and observed serial numbers of some pretty obscure earlier types of AR that we've seen online, I'm fairly confident dating it about 1979-80. But then you have earlier serial number ranges that are later guns, so it does get confusing. But this is, I think I'm right in saying, the only AR-15 in our extensive collection that, I mean, we know that a lot of the others have British service because they have the requisite features, but this is the only one where we have that little bit of service history, which is quite exciting. Now, if you want to know more about British Special Operations Forces in Belize, Rusty Firmin, who's quite a well-known ex-member of the SAS, has his autobiography entitled The Regiment, includes a chunk, or I think it crops up more than once because he was there more than once. Now, I said I would mention or come back to the pistol grip here, which is very distinctively bumpy. It's the A2, M16 A2 family pistol grip, intended to give you better control over the weapon. A lot of people absolutely hate it. I haven't had to use one in anger, but it doesn't bother me personally. It's also a little bit wider, better grip. Again, what's it doing on this A1? Well, it's actually quite a useful indicator of how long this thing would have seen service. So although we only have records of 2 operations that it went out on, it must have been in the armoury. Maybe it got broken in Belize. The early AR-15 furniture was very fragile and would break. The A1 era is pretty good, but if you drop it on a rock, it might still fracture. And it's an easy replacement, just a bolt to undo, swap the pistol grip. And they clearly were using A2 rifles, or A2 series rifles by that time. And so an armourer has put a pistol grip on it. I don't think it was done by the pattern room. Some of the modifications to rifles in our collection were done after the fact for testing or something. It's not impossible that it broke in the pattern room. It's a lot less likely though. So I think that's an indicator that this thing was in service until at least the end of the 1980s. Possibly and in the armoury for even longer than that, probably. So people might wonder, especially those who served with the SLR and think it's the best thing ever. I'm not going to say otherwise. Why on earth you'd be handing that in and picking up a plastic toy like this, as the meme sort of went for a while. It's a lot shorter. It's several inches shorter. It's a lot lighter. You know, £7 instead of £10 rifle. It's automatic is probably one of the main things for the Brits. We had adopted a semi-automatic only rifle. It's also long. It's also heavy. It certainly works in the jungle, and the round will actually carry through light, foliage and things better than the 5.56 round. So some might argue that this is not the best choice, but typically in the jungle you would be, well, some of you at least in the section would be using a submachine gun, machine carbine, even a Bren gun from the hip or firing bursts from the shoulder, and this thing is just way better than both of those things. So even if you think this is not the man's rifle that the SLR is, or the M16 in the similar Vietnam era debates over which is better, then it still has its place in somewhere like the jungle. As for special operations, SAS, SBS, a lot of the same applies there, and they're going to be operating in places like the jungle, but they have a much broader need for something like this, something light, portable. You carry way more ammo, you put down a lot of rounds if you have to, but if you don't, ideally you don't have to fire a shot, and this thing you can just carry around. It doesn't impede you in any way. So it was great for the Green Army, if you like, and for Special Operations Forces, and it's remained the Special Operations Forces or adjacent weapon of choice in the British Army and Royal Marines now for really quite a long time, which is why I'm so interested with Matt in doing this research. Thanks for watching, guys. If you'd like to see a little bit more behind the scenes with these videos, you can head over to TikTok, where we now have an active channel, so do check us out there. Otherwise, the usual things apply. We have 3 museums you can visit if you're in the UK. We have our website that you can look at. Especially keep an eye on the events programme, because there might be something coming up in the next month or so that you might like to come and check out at one of our sites. But whatever you do, join us here again next week.